how have we come to the point where we are that corporations have the same civil rights or individual rights that human beings have?
Well, corporations have a lot of constitutional rights. They don't have exactly the same ones. There was a constitutional amendment passed in 1868 to protect the rights of freed slaves against oppression by state governments. And that was used by corporate lawyers in the 1880s to get the Supreme Court to say that corporations were persons under the Constitution. And they would have, for the purposes of the 14th Amendment, equal protection and due process rights. And that wasn't even argued at the time, although two eloquent dissents in the Supreme Court were written in the 20th century to that. Supreme Court justices who were really upset about it. Justice Hugo Black in 1938 and Justice William Douglas in 1949 wrote eloquent, moving dissents on saying how absurd it was that an amendment passed to protect blacks against oppressive government was now being used to protect corporations against the sovereign people. It was established in the late 1880s, and it was used as an excuse to basically invalidate a number of state laws throughout the 1880s. The fact that corporations had the rights of equal protection and due process. And it became sort of a gateway right, so that after that we see dribbling in more and more parts of the Bill of Rights that have been granted as rights to corporations by judges. 5 members of the Supreme Court can declare just about any law in the United States unconstitutional. So as a matter of fact, every year or two, corporate lawyers write their latest amendments to the corporate law. They walk into the state legislatures, they toss it on a desk, and the state legislature passes it pretty much without any comment and certainly without any publicity. They do this all the time. And as long as there are no activists or working people or whatever watching the corporate code, it's getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and that list of powers is getting longer and longer. But I can give you an example of it. What that means is, if a corporation has equal protection rights, you cannot discriminate against the corporation, okay? To show you how absurd this can get, a few years ago, a local government in Massachusetts passed some ordinances about the location of cell towers. A major telecommunications corporation did not like them, so that telecommunications corporations used a combination of the 14th Amendment, equal protection rights, and the 1964 Civil Rights Law to sue the local municipality and ask damages because the civil rights of the corporation had been violated.
What are some of those rights that corporations now have?
One of them is the Fourth Amendment right to protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. This was first recognized in the early 20th century, and in a really famous case in 1978, it was used to prevent OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, from doing an inspection of corporate facilities. So we have a corporation using Bill of Rights protections, in this case the Fourth Amendment, to protect itself from the state inspection. And this is in the context of a corporation being created and brought to life literally by a state, because all corporations only exist because they have charters granted to them by state governments. Corporations are created by a state, and they used to be told exactly what to do, how much real estate they could own, how long they could exist, 10, 20 years. If they did anything outside that, their charters were revoked. It was almost automatic in some cases. It was fairly straightforward. So the idea was that since a corporation is created by a state, it's almost like a little piece of the government. And there's no question that the government, we the people acting through a legislature, would tell them what they can and can't do. So if any of those generalizations still held, and they held for quite a while, you wouldn't have a small group of corporate management making the decision what the corporation was for, where it was going to have its factories, and so on. The state that created it could make those decisions. So we would be in a very different situation now. If the workplace is a corporate facility or a corporation, the worker basically parks his or her rights at the door when he or she enters. At the same time, while the corporation, which is an imaginary thing, whatever the corporation is, which is not exactly the same as the management or the workers or the physical plant. The corporation itself has constitutional rights, including free speech rights. So you can force workers to sit in on be captives and be preached at and told all kinds of things which probably aren't true by management because the corporation has free speech rights. whereas most of the workers' ability to communicate, to organize, while they're on that work site are gone. So it's a special case for workers if they're on corporate property. But I think you can argue that the rest of us don't really appreciate or aren't allowed really to use as much of our equal protection rights as corporations are, because it takes money to play. If you look at the corporate law, what's essentially the charter of a corporation, there are no time limits, and it usually says it's granted in perpetuity. And this isn't something that's special out there, different from other laws. It's just a plain old law. Every state has a portion of its law that's about corporations, called the Corporate Code. And these days, what it basically consists of is a list of powers that the state is granting to the corporation. But without that list in a corporate law, the corporation doesn't have any powers.
So the powers that the corporation does have could be legislatively changed.
Exactly. It's just a list of powers. It's not even like in the state constitution, although once in a while there are some aspects of the Constitution that deal with corporations. For the most part, it's just in the law. And you're pointing to something interesting, because those of us who've been activists have probably spent lots of time maybe reading labor law, or reading environmental law, or reading human rights law, or reading about the insides of a nuclear power plant, or reading about the dredging in the creek and some sort of pollutant. So we've dealt with a lot of minutia, including legal minutia. But when it comes to this area of law, which basically grants corporations huge powers, pieces of state sovereignty, I've met very few activists who've even ever looked at corporate law.